He stole the one thing I ever made that mattered, or my dream like it was his own skin, and disappeared before I could even ask why. For 5 years I told myself I hated him. For 5 years I told myself the ache in my chest every October was just the cold coming in off the water. Then one rainy morning he walked back into the workshop where we fell in love, stood in the doorway dripping onto the floor I used to sweep for him, and said 4 words I never thought I'd hear again: I need to confess. He didn't come back for forgiveness. He came back because guilt had finally caught up to him faster than fame ever could. I told him if he wanted my heart again, he'd have to earn every splinter of it back with his own hands. What he did next, I never saw coming, and it nearly cost him everything he'd built his whole life to protect. But what happened next changed my life forever. The rain in Amberfell always arrived sideways, blown in off the Atlantic in long grey sheets that rattled the windows of the old glass workshop on Harbour Street like fingers asking to be let in. Elian Voss had learned to love that sound over the years, the way it drummed against the leaded panes he repaired for a living, panes he had cut and soldered and mourned over in equal measure. He was 29 now, though something about his eyes made him look older, the particular tiredness of a man who had once wanted something so badly that wanting it again felt like a threat to his survival. He ran Voss Son Stained Glass Restoration, though there had never been a son, only Elian, his father's tools, and a silence he had grown almost comfortable inside. He was soldering the border of a rose window destined for the old chapel on Cliffside Road when the bell above the door rang, and even before he looked up, something in his chest recognized the particular hesitation in the footsteps that followed. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a great many things over the years that turned out to be lies he needed in order to keep breathing. Callan Reyes stood in the doorway with rain running off his coat in dark ribbons, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. 5 years had changed him the way a chisel changes stone, sharpening what used to be soft, carving hollows beneath eyes that used to only ever look at Elian like he was the only warm thing in a cold world. Callan was 32 now, and famous, in the quiet, reverent way that architects become famous among people who care about light and glass and the small miracle of a building that breathes. His firm's name was on 3 cathedrals and a concert hall in Lisbon. His name was on a window that Elian had designed with his own 2 hands, in a winter that felt like 100 years ago and also like yesterday. I need to confess, Callan said, and his voice cracked on the second word, as if the sentence had been sitting in his throat for years, rotting. Elian set down the soldering iron with a steadiness that cost him more than Callan would ever know. Get out of my shop. Elian. You don't get to say my name like that. Not anymore. He wiped his hands on a rag that smelled of flux and old smoke, and made himself look at the man who had once been the only future he could imagine. You took the Whitfield window design. My design. The one we built together in Professor Anholt's studio, the one with the herons and the fractured light, the one you swore we would submit under both our names. You left in the night, Callan. You took my drawings and you left, and 18 months later I watched you accept an award for it on a stage in Boston, and you didn't so much as blink when the interviewer called it your vision. I know. You know. Elian laughed, and the sound was not kind. Do you have any idea what that did to me? I didn't touch glass for 2 years. I couldn't. Every time I picked up a piece I saw your hands cutting it instead of mine, because that's what everyone believed. That's what you let them believe. Rain hammered the windows. Somewhere behind Callan, a delivery truck groaned past on the wet street, headlights smearing gold across the glass panels stacked along the workshop wall, panels of saints and ships and herons in flight, all of it Elian's work, all of it anonymous. I'm not here to ask you to forgive me, Callan said quietly. I'm here because the chapel on Cliffside Road commissioned me to restore the Whitfield window. The original. It's cracking, Elian. 15 years of salt air and it's coming apart at the lead came, and I can't do it. I can't touch it, because every time I try to draw the herons my hands remember that they were never mine to draw in the first place. He swallowed. I told the diocese the truth. I told them I didn't design it. I told them the real artist works 2 streets from the chapel and his name is Elian Voss. For a long moment, Elian said nothing, because the workshop had gone strange and thin around him, like a held breath. You told them. I lost the contract for the concert hall in Prague because of it. My partners think I've lost my mind. Callan's jaw tightened, and something in his face that used to be so careful, so composed, cracked open like the window he'd come to talk about. I don't care. I should have said it 5 years ago, but I was a coward then, and I'm trying very hard not to be one now. Elian turned back to his workbench because he did not trust his own face. 5 years of carefully rationed grief were suddenly loose in his chest, and he hated how much of it still had Callan's shape. Why did you leave, Callan? Not the design. You. Why did you leave me, that night, with nothing but a note that said you were sorry? The silence that followed was long enough that Elian thought he wouldn't answer. Because I was drowning, Callan said finally, and I let myself believe that taking your work with me was the only way I'd survive the swim. My father had already spent the last of his savings on my education, and he was dying, and all he wanted before he died was to see my name on something real, something the world would remember. I told myself it was one window. I told myself you'd understand, eventually, if I ever had the courage to explain. I never had the courage. That's the truth, and it's an ugly one, and I've carried it every single day since. You let me become invisible so your father could be proud of you. Elian's voice was very quiet now, more dangerous for its quietness. You understand what that did? Not just to my work. To me. I thought I wasn't worth staying for. I thought whatever we had wasn't real enough to matter more than your name on a plaque. It mattered more than anything, Callan said, and for the first time his composure broke entirely, his voice raw and unguarded in a way Elian remembered from years ago, from nights with the workshop lamps burning low and their hands tangled together over unfinished glass. It's the only thing that's mattered since. I've built cathedrals, Elian, and none of them have ever felt like that studio did, the winter we made the herons together. Elian shut his eyes. Outside, the rain had gentled into a fine mist, and somewhere down the street a church bell rang the hour, muffled by the wet air. You don't get to say that and expect it to undo 5 years. I don't expect anything. Callan took a step further into the shop, careful, the way a man walks into a room he's not sure he's welcome in. I came to give you your name back on that window, publicly, whatever it costs me. That's not a bargain for your heart. I know I don't deserve that. I just couldn't let you go on being erased. For a long time Elian only looked at him, at the rain still clinging to his shoulders, at the exhaustion carved into a face that used to make him feel safer than anywhere else in the world. He thought of every year he had spent convincing himself he was over it, and how thin that conviction suddenly felt now that Callan was standing 3 feet away, real and rain-soaked and terrifyingly honest. If you want anything from me, Elian said at last, and I mean anything, even just to stand in the same room as me without flinching, you will earn it. Not with an apology. Not with a confession to a diocese. You will help me restore that window, properly, with your own hands, in front of anyone who asks, and you will tell them the truth every single time, and you will do it because it's right, not because it might win me back. And even then, Callan, I make no promises. Do you understand? I understand, Callan said, and something in the way he said it, low and certain, made Elian believe, despite every instinct screaming at him not to, that he meant it. The cliffside chapel stood on a bluff at the edge of Amberfell, its stone the color of wet sand, its bell tower leaning very slightly toward the sea as though it had spent 2 centuries listening for ships that never came home. The Whitfield window filled the eastern wall of its nave, 7 feet of leaded glass depicting a flock of herons rising from a fractured dawn, the kind of image that made grown men stop mid-stride when the morning light hit it right. Elian had designed every bird himself, had spent a whole December arguing with Callan about whether the light behind the wings should be gold or the color of skimmed milk, had won that argument, had loved winning it because Callan always looked at him afterward like he'd just watched something impossible happen. They began the restoration on a Tuesday, in a nave that smelled of candle wax and cold stone, with Father Iverson, a soft-spoken man with silver hair and quick, curious eyes, watching from the back pew as though he sensed something being repaired that had nothing to do with lead cane. "The cane here has crystallized," Elian said, running gloved fingers along a seam near the base of the tallest heron's wing. "Salt air does that. It'll need releading, and this pane," he touched a fracture running like a lightning bolt through the amber glass of a sunrise, "this will need to be cut new, matched exactly, or the whole composition falls out of balance." "Show me," Callan said, and there was none of the practiced ease he wore in interviews, none of the polish. He watched Elian's hands the way a man watches something he is afraid to lose again. They worked in silence for most of that first week, an old, wary silence, both of them relearning how to exist in the same 6 feet of space without either flinching or reaching. Elian caught himself, more than once, glancing at Callan's hands as they measured glass, remembering how those same hands used to trace the shape of his jaw in the dark. He hated how easily the memory surfaced. He hated more how much he wanted it to. It was on the 9th day, with rain lashing the chapel's high windows and the two of them kneeling on the cold stone floor fitting a new pane of amber glass, that Callan finally spoke of something other than the work. "I looked for you," he said, not looking up from the cane he was shaping. "After. I told myself I wouldn't, and then 6 months in I drove past this town at 2 in the morning and sat outside your father's old shop for 3 hours and never once got out of the car." "Why didn't you?" "Because I knew if I saw your face, I'd tell you everything, and I was still telling myself the lie was kinder than the truth." He set the tool down, and his hands, Elian noticed, were shaking very slightly. "I've spent 5 years designing buildings people call beautiful, and none of them, not one, ever felt like it does standing in this room with you." Elian said nothing for a long moment, watching the gray light fracture through the unfinished window and scatter across the floor between them like something spilled. "You don't get to make this romantic, Callan. You don't get to turn my forgiveness into the emotional climax of your comeback story." "I'm not trying to." Callan's voice was rough. "I know exactly what I am. I'm the man who let you disappear so I could be seen. I'm not asking you to feel anything. I'm asking you to let me finish what I started, and if at the end of it you never want to see me again, I will live with that, because it will still be more honest than anything I gave you before." Father Iverson, from the back of the nave, cleared his throat gently, and both men startled like teenagers caught somewhere they shouldn't be. "The bishop is coming Sunday to see the progress," he said, mild and knowing. "Perhaps you'll want the story ready by then. The true one, I mean." That Sunday came faster than either of them wanted it to. The bishop, a tall, precise woman named Marisol Danvers who had flown in from the diocesan office in Providence, stood beneath the half-restored window with her hands folded and her eyes sharp with the particular skepticism of someone who had heard 100 restoration proposals and trusted very few of them. "Mr. Reyes," said, "your firm has an impressive record. I confess I was surprised to hear you'd stepped back and brought in an independent restorer." The chapel went very quiet. Elian felt his own pulse in his throat. "Because the window isn't mine," Callan said, and his voice did not waver, though Elian could see the effort it cost him, the way his hands curled slightly at his sides as if bracing for impact. "It never was. I designed nothing here. Elian Voss designed every pane of this window when we were students together, and I took the drawings and the credit when I left, because I was afraid of being ordinary and he made everything he touched extraordinary and I wanted some of that light for myself. I've spent 5 years building a career on a theft I never corrected. I'm correcting it now, publicly, and if the diocese wants to revoke my firm's name from the original commission records, I will help you do it myself." Bishop Danvers looked at him for a long moment, then turned to Elian with an expression that had shifted from skepticism into something gentler. "Is this true?" "It's true," Elian said, and saying it out loud, in this cold stone room full of light he had made with his own hands, felt like setting down something he had carried so long he'd forgotten its weight. "Then it will be corrected," the bishop said simply. "The parish records will bear your name, Mr. Voss, and the plaque beside the window will be recast." Glanced once more at Callan, not unkindly. "It takes a particular kind of courage to dismantle your own reputation in front of a stranger." I hope you understand what it's cost you. I do, Callan said quietly, and did not look away. Word of it moved through Amberfell the way weather does, fast and total, and within a week 2 of Callan's remaining clients had quietly withdrawn their commissions, uneasy at the scandal of an architect confessing to theft, however honorably. His partners in Boston called twice, then stopped calling. The magazine profile that had been scheduled to run that spring, the one meant to cement his reputation as one of the great young voices in sacred architecture, was pulled entirely. Elian watched all of it happen from a careful distance, half expecting Callan to soften, to backpedal, to find some version of the truth more convenient than the one he'd already told. Instead, Callan kept showing up at the chapel every morning at 7, kneeling on the same cold stone, cutting glass with hands that had once designed cathedrals and now simply, humbly, helped restore someone else's dream. It was on a grey afternoon in late March, with the last of the herons finally set back into their leaded frame and the window whole again for the first time in 15 years, that Elian found Callan sitting alone in the front pew, staring up at the finished glass with an expression Elian hadn't seen on him since they were 24 and reckless with hope. "It's more beautiful than I remembered," Callan said, without turning. "I forgot how the light does that, right at the seam of the wings. Like the birds are always half a second from finishing the sentence they're trying to say." "I remember exactly what you said the day we finished the design," Elian said, sitting beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, close enough that some old animal part of him ached at the nearness. "You said it looked like hope caught mid-flight. I used to think about that sentence more than I ever admitted." "I lost my firm's biggest client this week," Callan said. "The concert hall in Prague, gone for good. My old partners think I've ruined myself." He turned to look at Elian then, and his eyes were wet, though he did not let the tears fall. "I don't regret it. Not for 1 second. I finally feel like the man I used to think I could be, before I decided being impressive mattered more than being honest." "You gave up everything you built to give me back something you took," Elian said slowly, as if testing the shape of the realization in his mouth. "I didn't think you had that in you anymore. I'm not sure I ever really knew if you did, even before." "I didn't either," Callan admitted. "Not until I watched you solder that first pane back into place and realized I would rather lose every cathedral in the world than lose the chance to stand beside you while you did it." Elian looked up at the finished window, at herons rising into a dawn made of glass and gold, made by his own hands, credited now under his own name, standing exactly where it belonged after 5 years of silence. He thought of the boy who had broken something in him that he'd spent years convincing himself could never be repaired, and the man now sitting beside him, stripped of the armor of ambition, offering nothing but the truth and the slow, unglamorous work of earning something back one small honest act at a time. "I'm not there yet," Elian said, quiet but steady. "I don't know if I'll ever fully trust you the way I did before. That kind of trust, once it's broken, doesn't grow back exactly the same shape." "I don't need it to be the same shape," Callan said. "I just need the chance to keep showing up, for as long as it takes, however that ends." Elian didn't answer with words. Instead he reached over and took Callan's hand, the same hand that had once traced his jaw in the dark and later signed someone else's name to his dreams, and held it, carefully, the way you hold something you are not yet ready to trust but are no longer willing to let go of entirely. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and thin March sunlight broke through the clouds and poured through the restored window, scattering herons of colored light across the stone floor at their feet, rising, the both of them, slowly, towards something that finally, after everything, felt like it might be real. Spring came to Amberfell the way it always did, reluctantly, the harbor thawing in patches, gulls returning to argue over the fish stalls on the pier. Elian reopened his father's shop under a new sign that read Voss Glass Studio, and for the first time in 5 years he took on an apprentice, a nervous 19-year-old named Teo who reminded him, in small unbearable ways, of who he used to be before the world taught him to be careful. Callan came by most evenings, not as a lover yet, not quite, but as something patient and steady, sweeping floors, fetching coffee, sitting quietly in the corner reading blueprints for a small firm he was building from nothing, one honest commission at a time. It was not the ending either of them would have written, 5 years ago, in that reckless winter when they first fell for each other over sketches of herons and shared silence. It was slower than that, and harder one, built the way Elian built everything now, pane by careful pane, tested for cracks before it was ever asked to hold the light. But on the evening the cliffside chapel unveiled its finished window to the whole town, with Father Iverson ringing the bell and the plaque finally recast with Elian's name gleaming in new brass beneath the glass, Callan stood beside him at the back of the nave, close enough that their hands brushed, and Elian let them. Earning it, Callan murmured, watching candlelight scatter gold across the restored herons, turns out to be the only kind of love I ever actually understood how to give. I just didn't know it until I nearly lost the chance to give it at all. Elian said nothing, but he did not step away, and when Callan's hand finally found his in the dim, forgiving light of the chapel, he let their fingers close together, slowly, the way two broken pieces of the same window finally, carefully, come to rest exactly where they were always meant to be. He showed up at my shop with a box of my father's old letters and a truth he swore would end whatever we were slowly rebuilding. For months I'd let him back in one careful inch at a time, watching his hands learn honesty again the way you'd watch a man relearn how to walk. I thought the worst secret between us had already been spoken inside that chapel. I was wrong. There was one more, older than either of us, buried in my father's handwriting, tied to the very night I was born into this town's quiet grief. Callan found it before I did, and he had a choice: bury it to protect the fragile thing we'd built, or hand it to me and risk losing me forever to a truth neither of us was ready to hold. He chose the harder thing. And what he told me that night didn't just test our love. It rewrote everything I thought I knew about who I was. Summer arrived in Amberfell slow and gold, the harbor smelling of tar and salt and the sweet rot of low tide, and for the first time in 5 years Elian Voss woke most mornings without the particular ache that used to greet him before his eyes even opened. Callan had become, in the 4 months since the chapel's window was unveiled, something between a habit and a hope, a quiet presence at the edge of Elian's days that neither of them had yet dared to name out loud. They were not lovers again, not exactly, though the space between them had narrowed to something thin enough that either of them could have closed it with a single sentence. Neither had said the sentence yet. Trust, Elian had learned, rebuilt itself slower than glass ever did, and he was in no hurry to rush a repair that mattered more than any window he'd ever made. It was a Tuesday in July when Callan came to the shop not with coffee or blueprints but with a wooden box Elian had never seen before, battered at the corners, tied shut with twine gone soft with age. His face, when Elian looked up from the workbench, had none of its usual careful composure. "I found this at the Cliffside Archive," Callan said. "Father Iverson let me into the old parish storage while I was pulling records for the plaque recasting. It was filed under Voss. I thought it might be your father's correspondence with the church, old commission letters, nothing more." I didn't expect. He stopped, and Elian watched something in his throat work before he continued. "I didn't expect to find letters between your father and mine." Elian set down the glass cutter very carefully, the way a man sets down something he suspects might shatter regardless of how gently it's handled. "Our fathers never knew each other. Your father was a shipping clerk in Providence. Mine never left this town in his life." "That's what I thought too." Callan placed the box on the workbench between them like an offering, or an accusation, or both. "Elian, I read 3 of these before I understood what I was looking at, and then I couldn't make myself read the rest without you here. I think you should open it yourself." The twine came apart easily, softened by decades of damp storage, and inside lay perhaps 30 letters, their paper gone the color of weak tea, the handwriting on the outer envelopes unmistakably Elian's father's careful, slanted script, addressed again and again to a man named Thomas Reyes at an address in Providence that Elian recognized, with a small cold jolt, as the house Callan had grown up in. "Read the first one," Callan said quietly. "Please." Elian's hands were not steady as he unfolded the brittle paper. The letter was dated some 31 years earlier, and it began, in his father's unmistakable hand, "Thomas, I don't know how to say this except plainly. Marguerite is gone, and the boy is mine to raise, and I understand now what you meant when you said some kinds of love cost more than either of us can afford. I will not ask you for anything more than you already gave. I only ask that you never tell him, not until he's old enough to survive knowing it, that his mother chose to leave us both, and that the reason has your name written all over it." Elian read the sentence 3 times before the meaning of it fully assembled itself in his mind, and when it did, the workshop seemed to tilt very slightly, the way a boat tilts when a wave arrives from an unexpected direction. "My mother," he said slowly. "My mother died when I was 2. That's what my father always told me." "A fever," he said. "Died of a fever when I was 2 years old." "Keep reading," Callan said, and his voice had gone very careful, the voice of a man walking someone across ice he isn't sure will hold. The second letter, dated 8 months after the first, was shorter, and colder. "Thomas, I have decided. I will tell him died. It will be kinder than the truth, that left us both for a life thought your family could give her, and that when your father forbade the marriage, simply kept walking and never once looked back at either of us. I don't blame you for your father's cruelty. I blame myself for ever believing love was enough to outrun it. Please, for the boy's sake, let this be the last we ever write to each other." Elian set the letter down with hands that had gone entirely numb. "Didn't die. Left. My mother left because your grandfather wouldn't allow her to marry your father, and my father spent the rest of his life letting me believe she died so I'd never have to carry the shame of being left behind twice over." He looked up at Callan, and something in his voice cracked open, raw and disbelieving. "Your father and my mother. That's what this is. That's the thing hiding under everything my father never told me." "There's one more letter," Callan said, so quietly it was almost lost beneath the sound of gulls arguing somewhere out on the harbor. "The last one in the box. It's dated the year I was born." Elian's fingers shook as he opened it, and he read it aloud this time, because some part of him needed to hear the words in his own voice to believe they were real. "Thomas, I heard about your son. Congratulations, though it costs me something to write that word. I think of my own boy every day and wonder what it means that our lives keep circling each other this way, 2 men who loved the same woman and lost her to the same cruelty, raising sons 3 towns apart who will likely never know the other exists. Perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps some kinds of history are better left buried where they can't reach forward and touch the next generation. I hope your boy grows up gentler than either of us managed to." The workshop had gone entirely silent except for the tick of the old clock above the workbench and, somewhere far off, the low grinding hum of a fishing boat's engine coming into harbor. "You knew," Elian said finally, and his voice had an edge in it now, sharp and frightened all at once. "When did you know, Callan? How long have you had this box before you brought it to me?" "For days," Callan said immediately, evenly, meeting Elian's eyes without flinching. "I read the first letter and I understood immediately what it meant, and I spent 4 days terrified that if I gave this to you, it would break whatever fragile thing we've been building since the chapel. I thought about burning it. I want you to know that. I stood over the workshop stove in my apartment with these letters in my hand and I thought about how much easier it would be if this history simply disappeared, the way it was clearly meant to." His jaw tightened. "And then I thought about the year I spent letting you disappear so I could keep something I didn't deserve, and I understood that if I buried this to protect what we have now, I would be doing exactly the same thing to you all over again, just with a different secret." Elian looked down at the letters scattered across his workbench, at 3 decades of silence written in his own father's careful hand, at the discovery that the mother he'd mourned his whole life as dead had, in fact, simply walked away, and that the man standing in front of him now, the one he was slowly, painfully learning to trust again, was somehow woven into that same old wound by blood and circumstance neither of them had ever chosen. "We're not related," he said abruptly, needing to say it out loud. Needing to hear it confirmed. "Your father and my mother were never married. You and I share no blood." "None," Callan said. "I checked twice, with a lawyer in Providence, before I ever brought this box near you. I needed to be certain before I let myself feel anything about what it might mean for us, and I needed you to know I checked before you even had to ask." Something in Elian's chest that had been braced, rigid, ready to shatter, loosened slightly at that. You were afraid to tell me. And you told me anyway. I've spent my whole adult life choosing the easier lie over the harder truth, Callan said. I promised myself in that chapel that I was done doing that, no matter what it cost me. This might cost me you entirely, and I brought it to you anyway, because you deserve to know where you actually come from, even if the knowing hurts. Elian sat down slowly on the stool beside his workbench, the letters spread before him like shards of a window he hadn't known was broken until this moment, and for a long time he said nothing at all, only stared at his father's handwriting, 30 years old, still carrying the particular ache of a man who had chosen silence because he believed it was kinder than truth. I need to see my father's grave, Elian said finally. I need to stand there and tell him I know. I don't know why, but I need to say it out loud where he can hear it, even if he can't. I'll drive you, Callan said, or I'll stay here if you'd rather go alone. Whatever you need. Come with me, Elian said, and the words surprised him even as he spoke them, because a year ago, even 6 months ago, he would never have imagined wanting Callan beside him for something this raw, this unguarded. But something had shifted in the months since the chapel, some old scar tissue finally softening enough to let new trust root itself underneath, and Elian found that he did not want to face this alone, and that the man he wanted beside him was, impossibly, still Callan. They stood together that evening at the small cemetery on the hill above the harbor, where Elian's father lay beneath a modest granite stone that read only Samuel Voss, beloved father, master of glass, and Elian spoke quietly to the stone in a voice that shook only slightly, telling his father that he understood now, that he forgave him for the lie, that he wished more than anything his father had trusted him enough, even once, to share the weight of that old grief instead of carrying it alone for 30 years. Callan stood a few respectful steps behind him, saying nothing, simply present, the late sun throwing long gold shadows across the grass, and when Elian finally turned back toward him, his face wet in a way he made no effort to hide, Callan did not reach for him, did not crowd him, only waited, steady, until Elian closed the distance himself. Thank you for not burning the letters, Elian said, his voice rough. You could have. I would never have known. I would have known, Callan said simply. That was always going to be enough to stop me. They walked back down the hill together as the sky deepened into the particular bruised violet of a coastal summer evening, gulls wheeling home toward the harbor, the old bell in Cliffside Chapel ringing faintly in the distance, and somewhere in the quiet space between them, unspoken but finally, unmistakably real, something settled into place the way a piece of glass settles into lead cane that has, at last, been shaped precisely to hold it. Elian did not say the word love that night, not yet, but he let his hand find Callan's as they walked, and he did not let go, and for the first time since a rainy morning 5 years ago when everything had broken apart, that felt like more than enough.